Session 1. Paul the Man, His Background and Encounter with Jesus. What we know of the Apostle Paul comes mostly from two sources. His traveling companion Luke, who recorded Paul's history in the last half of the book of Acts, and the letters Paul wrote. They are known as the Pauline epistles. The book of Acts has 28 chapters. In it, the apostle is called Saul until chapter 13. Then he is called Paul thereafter. In his letters, he never calls himself Saul. By the time of the name change in Acts, Paul has been a Christian for some 14 years, so the change is not the result of his conversion. In Roman culture, citizens had three names given at birth: prenomen, first name; nomen, Gentile family name; and cognomen, primary Latin name. Paul would also have been given an additional Jewish name, supernomen. We do not know his prenomen or nomen, but his cognomen was Paulus. The Jewish name given to him by his parents was Saul. It is possible they chose this name because they are of the tribe of Benjamin, and the most prominent Benjaminite in Israel's history was King Saul. The apostle was then both Saul and Paul from birth. It makes sense that he might go by his Jewish name of Saul during his upbringing in Judaism, and by his Roman name of Paul once his primary ministry focus became outreach to Roman Gentiles, which happened in Acts chapter 13. What kind of upbringing did Saul have? Well, he was born not in Israel, but in this town, Tarsus, the principal city of Cilicia, which is in southeastern Asia Minor, that is, modern-day Turkey. Tarsus was a privileged city in the Roman Empire. It was prosperous, exempt from Roman taxation, cultured, and famous for its schools. It was a university town, just behind the class of Alexandria, Egypt, and Athens, Greece, as a center of learning. Recognizing these things, Paul calls Tarsus no ordinary city. Paul's parents were displaced Jews. They were part of the dispersed population of Jews living outside of Palestine ever since the Babylonian exile of Israel. This was called the diaspora. On this map you can see the extent of the Jewish diaspora scattered throughout the Roman Empire in the 1st century. Every red dot represents a city with a known Jewish population. Paul grew up in the Greek culture and atmosphere of Tarsus. In addition to Aramaic and Hebrew, he spoke fluent Greek, and he quotes from at least 3 Greek poets in his writings. Paul's parents were devout Jews. Paul says he was a Hebrew born of Hebrews. This suggests that he and his family remained faithful to the language and customs of Palestinian Judaism. In fact, they were among the most strict of Jews. They were Pharisees. Interestingly, Paul was born a Roman citizen. How this came about is not known, but it is likely that somehow his father had become a Roman citizen before him. Such privilege was rare for a Jew. In the future, this status would allow Paul to escape prison, avoid punishment, and plead his case before the Roman emperor. Jewish law prescribed that a boy begin the study of the scriptures at 5 years of age, and the study of the legal traditions at 10. At 13, a Jewish boy became a bar mitzvah, which means son of the commandment, at which time he took upon himself the full obligation of the law. More commonly today, the term bar mitzvah refers to the coming-of-age ceremony associated with the event. Thereafter, the more promising lads received further training. Thus, when Paul was of age, he was sent to Jerusalem to train under the most illustrious Pharisee of his day, Gamaliel. Here he excelled. He was a prodigy among Pharisees. He describes his training as thorough, his advancement in Judaism as exceeding that of his peers, his fervor extremely zealous, and his observance of the law faultless. Paul was also trained in a secular occupation. Bible translations say that he was a tent maker, but exactly what he made is not stated. The region of Cilicia was known for a goat hair cloth called cilicium, used to make not only tents, but various products such as awnings and boat sails. We know that Paul had a sister and nephew. We do not know if Paul ever had a wife. It would have been unusual for a man of his social and religious status to be unmarried, but we do know that by the time he wrote Corinthians, he was not married, that is, never married, widower, or divorcee. In Galatians, Paul describes a physical infirmity. He doesn't further elaborate other than to say that it was a difficulty for him and the Galatians, and that they would have given him their eyes if they could. That leads some to think that this was an ocular disorder. If it affected his vision, it might explain why Paul wrote using big letters at the end of the book. This may be the same problem that he describes in Corinthians as a thorn in my flesh, though that could be a separate issue and not necessarily a physical one. Paul also bore on his body the marks of Jesus. We can only guess that these were the scars of beatings suffered by Paul as a minister of the gospel, in which he considered a badge of honor. What did Paul look like? Many statues over the centuries have depicted him as a tall, handsome, dynamic, and dominant figure, but that may not have been the case. In Latin, Paulus means small. There was an incident in the town of Lystra, and we'll talk about it next session, where Paul and Barnabas were mistaken for gods. It may be significant that the townsfolk thought Barnabas was Zeus, the chief of the Olympic gods, and Paul was his son, Hermes, the winged messenger. The implication is that Barnabas was associated with the grander, more imposing figure, and Paul was seen as the physically inferior one. This is all just guessing, but an early description of him comes from the 2nd century. Paul is said to be a man small of stature, with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting and nose somewhat hooked, full of friendliness, for now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel. So pictures such as these may be more on the mark. Notice the upper right painting. It is the earliest known depiction of Paul. Considering Paul's influence and leadership, you would think that he was a great orator. Apparently not so. Some of his opponents said, his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Paul freely admits to the Corinthians that he came to them without eloquence or human wisdom. It is probable that Paul was a young man in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' ministry and crucifixion there, but there's no indication that Paul ever saw or met Christ at that time. Nonetheless, Paul must have gotten wind of Christ's teaching, for he became violently opposed to the Christian church and ultimately its foremost antagonist. Paul is described graphically as breathing murderous threats against Christians. He oversaw the execution of the first Christian martyr, Stephen, and thereafter made it his mission to track down and arrest Christians, including those who had fled to outlying areas. All this changed one day on a road to the city of Damascus, where Paul intended to arrest Christ followers. You may be familiar with the story, which you'll find in Acts 9. He was on his way to destroy, almost single-handedly, the Christian church. But suddenly he was engulfed in a blinding light. He fell to the ground, and he heard the voice of Christ saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus." Saul not only heard his voice, but he saw the Lord, who said, "Now get up and go into the city." There was probably even more to the conversation than Acts tells us, but it is remarkable that Saul was immediately changed by the overwhelming experience. Thereafter, Paul never doubted that he had had a miraculous encounter with the living and powerful Jesus Christ. Through the help of a Christian named Ananias, Paul regained his sight, but more than that, he gained enormous insight into the things of God. His perspective made a complete 180. He was now convinced that Jesus is alive and exalted. His views and activities in Judaism had been wrong, and he had been appointed by Jesus himself for mission to the Gentiles. Now, the born-again Paul was an apostle, if we define an apostle as one who has encountered the risen Christ and is sent on mission by him. He introduces himself as such in 9 of his letters. Luke describes him as an apostle in Acts. That he was a genuine apostle of the faith was confirmed by the Jerusalem apostles in Galatians 2. The only apostle who even comes close to having the credentials of Paul is Peter. In the book of Acts, Luke portrays Paul as a hero whose apostleship is fully confirmed by the same signs as Peter. Peter healed a lame man, and so did Paul. Peter's shadow had healing power, but so did Paul's clothing. Peter exorcised, and so did Paul. Peter had a victorious encounter with a sorcerer, and so had Paul. And Peter raised the dead, and so did Paul. This then is the man we study in this course. As F.F. Bruce says, I cannot think of any other writer, ancient or modern, whose study is so richly rewarding as his. This is due to several aspects of his many-faceted character: the attractive warmth of his personality, his intellectual stature, the exhilarating release effected by his gospel of redeeming grace, the dynamism with which he propagated that gospel throughout the world, devoting himself single-mindedly to fulfilling the commission entrusted to him on the Damascus Road, and laboring more abundantly than all his fellow apostles. In our next session, called Sharing the Gospel, we will see how Paul labored more abundantly than all his fellow apostles. We'll see Paul for his determined hard work for the gospel that endured the suffering of imprisonments, beating, shipwrecks, poverty, and fatigue to further its reach into the world. These things did not sap his love for God or his commitment to the cause of Christ. Next time, we'll talk about how Paul got started in ministry, and we'll look at where he went and when, who he went with, and what he did when he got there.